Now, we're looking all month long at be the change. What does it mean to be the change that God has called us to be? And last week we looked at church planting. This week we're going to look at the whole dimension of what does it mean to work around the world. Now, you just heard it. I want to just rehearse you a little bit. What is the purpose of NorthWood? Yeah, come on. What's the purpose of NorthWood? Okay, it's glorify God. Right? What's the purpose of NorthWood? What's the purpose? Brian, what's a purpose? Well, young man, what's a purpose? What's a purpose, lady? That's right. All right, what's the purpose of Northwood? Now, with enthusiasm, Northwood exists to... That's right. Now, what does it mean to glorify God? We're just going to dance around, sing, and jump up and down? I don't think so. One of the songs gave a clue. It said that we are going to live for your glory. Now, there are three ways that we glorify God. The first way we say is transparent connections. What is that? Transparent connections. It's worship. So it's interactive relationship. I'm sorry. You got it, Mark. You're an educator. All right. It's interactive relationship with God. It's personal worship with God. It's the ability to pray and hear from God. So what's the first way? Interactive relationship. 1, 2, 3. Again. With intensity. And the second, so once we worship God, worship is crucial because it's not just about woohoo, woohoo. It's about hearing God speak to you on a daily basis. And you're not going to hear God speak to you on a daily basis if you don't know how to worship. So that's crucial. So the second thing is transparent connections. Say it. Again. Louder. All right, that's good. And that's where you become a disciple and you're in a small group. And the third thing we do is what we call local impact. Now, if you're visiting, we're not stutterers. I was when I was a little kid, really bad. But it's Glocal. Global impact. Now, let me help you understand that. Global means Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Some people have the idea first it's Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, then the uttermost parts of the world. That's not what it says. It's not describing the sequence of events. It's describing the dimensions that we are supposed to be working in. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the world. So we call that what? Local impact. What? What? Okay, and so that's where we teach you to use your job to make a difference. So, Northwood, the purpose of Northwood is what? And the first way we do that is? And the second way we do that is? And the third way we do that is? Now, if we're going to worship, we're going to do what? No, we're going to have an interactive relationship. Now, come on. We exist to glorify God. Those three little things help us understand it. So one more time. Why do we exist? And the first way we do it, which is worship. The next way, which is discipleship. And the third way, which is engaging. Now, that's what I want to talk to you about today. And let me tell you some things that are very interesting. We are what we are today, not because we started right here and got everything put together and then we moved out. That's not how it happened here. That's a fact. We are what we are today because we started here, focused on the church, and in 1992, God broke me and He broke a lot of us because we were so obsessed with growing a big church that we forgot what the church was. And we had to come back and ask the hard question, why does the church exist? And it doesn't exist for me, it doesn't exist for you, it doesn't exist for anything other than God. Let me make it real clear. This is not your church. This is not my church. This is God's church, and you're just a pawn here along with me. That's it. And God broke us, and when He broke us, one of the things that He did was immediately exposed us to the world. And He laid on our heart that we ought to be working in this country called Vietnam. And I did not want to work in your country. My father's a pastor. Many soldiers died. Many soldiers were buried. Let me be honest. I did not like Vietnam. I did not like Vietnamese people. I told God, I will work anywhere, but not Vietnam. And God began to speak to my heart because there was a man who was an atheist, who's a very successful surgeon, who started coming to our church, and he accepted Christ. And we began to pray about where God would have us to focus, because we realized if we were going to make a difference in the world, we couldn't just bebop everywhere. We needed to focus in somewhere. He said, you know, I dropped a lot of bombs, and I was a part of being a soldier, shot down 3 times in Vietnam. I survived all 3 times. I'd like to go back to Vietnam. I didn't want to go. A week later, I get a call, and there was a special conference that was being held in Cambodia, and I was asked to speak there, and they were paying my way to go, and they were stopping in Hanoi. And so I went, and God began to break my heart for the people of Hanoi in Vietnam. It's the first time I saw grown men from another country holding hands together. I'm from Texas. We don't do that. It took some adjustment to get used to. And I want you to hear me. That changed everything. Because prior to that, I saw church in very Western eyes. I saw church as the Sunday event. I saw faith as something that made me a better person. And my job as a pastor prior to that was to get people converted and improved. That's how I understood the kingdom of God. Listen to me. To be holy is to be righteous, to stand before God, and to deal with sin in our life. To give God glory is to live beyond yourself. It's not just to be improved. It's not just to be moral. It's to live beyond yourself. And that's everything. And it's been an adventure. So I went. And when my son was 8, my wife and I scrimped and saved, and I took him. He grew up, in my culture, we grew up thinking all communists were bad. In his culture, as an 8-year-old, he grew up loving Vietnamese, not even understanding that concept. For him, he loved it. It led to my son studying at NYU in international economics, learning Arabic, and his dream is to be a global businessman. When my daughter was 11, she went. It changed her life. She's now studying social work at Baylor, has had 4 years of Chinese. Thank God it's over. Tired of praying her through those classes. And her dream is to have a string of orphanages all over the Near East, somewhere in the world. That's her dream, or to be a child's advocate. It's changed my family. People say, Bob, was it worth it? I mean, yeah, it was worth it. It was worth every bit of it. Because what I discovered was God was bigger than the little box I'd put him in. And until I could see the world through the eyes of God, I was just another preacher on the corner, trying to grow a really big church, having the best really good show. Candidly, I'm more concerned about glorifying God than I am the show or anything else. But to do that's a real problem, because you have to live beyond yourself. I push you to read through the Bible every year. This year I really want to push you, and I do. And it's not a matter of reading through the Bible for me. We teach it in our new members class. What I do is I read 2 or 3 chapters out of the Old Testament, a piece of wisdom literature, 1 chapter, and 1 chapter out of the New Testament every day. And I write down my prayers in that Bible. I have a journal that I open, and I write in that journal what God is saying to me. And starting right now, I'm reading through my journal nonstop. I'm discovering, what did God do this last year? What did he say this last year? I'll be reading all my other journals because I'm trying to hear from God. Something I do all the time, because I've discovered God works in certain ways. And as I've read his word, it's come alive to me. I want to encourage you to do the same thing. Right now, be thinking about that 1-year Bible. Go to a Go get you a wide margin Bible. Order it off the internet. You can get it at a Christian bookstore, but get you a wide margin Bible. Get ready. Read through the Bible this year and hear what God has to say. Well, I finished early. And so as a result of that, I began to say, God, I just want you to speak to me. And so I camped out for the last several weeks in one book. And I've read that little book in the Bible again and again and again and again and again and again. I have sobbed through that little book in the Bible. I have put my life up against that little book in the Bible. And I've said, God, speak to me. And it's the book of Galatians. And I'm supposed to do this in one sermon. Just don't worry about it. I'll stop when it's time. How's that? And I'll just preach next week what I don't get through. But that little book has become incredibly alive to me in the past few weeks. I'm doing something else. I wanted to get a Bible and cut it out like Jefferson did, but I felt sinful doing that. But I'm writing all the words of Jesus, and I'm putting them in a journal. And I'm journaling on that. What did Jesus say? You know, the red parts of the Bible? I just feel sinful cutting the pages out of the Bible. Why am I doing that? Because I want to hear from God. This isn't church stuff for me. It's not Sunday stuff for me. It's not religious stuff for me. For me, it's God stuff. I want to hear from God. That little book of Galatians is incredible. Let me tell you about that book. It was that book that God got a hold of Martin Luther with, who started the Protestant Reformation. And as Luther was reading that book, a man who worked incredibly hard to see his life change, it was in that book that he discovered that knowing God was more than following rules or doing penance, but it was a matter of grace. And if he could just accept what Jesus had done on the cross, what God had done through his grace, his life would be changed. That book had a profound impact upon John Wesley. John Wesley, who had worked hard at trying to follow God, worked hard at trying to obey God, worked hard at doing everything. But when he began to read Galatians, he began to have this sense of freedom. Because prior to that, he felt like salvation was too much of something that he was working for, something he was earning, something he was trying to find. We're talking about being the change. I want to see the world changed. Every time I'm in Vietnam, I look at young people and I look at teenagers and I look at rice farmers and I look at the poor on the side of the road and I think to myself, those people are brilliant. If they just had an opportunity, they could be doctors and engineers and nurses and teachers. No matter where I'm at in the world, I see that again. If they just had the opportunity, I want to see all Vietnamese have the same opportunity. I want to see the whole world have the same opportunity that I've had. I want to see change. I want to see change in this country. We are so far away from God. I want to see radical change in this country. That's why we plant churches. That's why we make disciples. I want to see change in Keller, Texas. I want to see the divorce rate drop. I want to see abuse issues go down. I want to see people become generous. Did you know that during the Great Depression, people gave 7% of their income to charity? Do you know what people are giving today in America? What percentage of their income to charity? 2%. Think about it. See, here's the problem. We can go to church and be good and moral, and yet the gospel not change us. The question is, what does it take for the gospel to change us? To make our thinking different, to make our lives different, to make everything about us different. And that's the whole point of Galatians, because it's the idea that he's looking beyond just surface change. Gandhi said it. We're saying be the change, but really that's a statement from Gandhi, because what Gandhi said was be the change you hope to be or you want. So what does it mean to live out that change? What are the implications in change for that to happen? Because it's everything and it matters. And I think if we listen to Paul, we have to understand that he knew a little bit about change because God changed him radically. And so he's writing the book of Galatians, and change is huge. Because now following Jesus has skipped beyond the Jews following Jesus, and now it's Gentiles following Jesus. It's huge. And so here is Paul. And what he's trying to do, he's trying to help us go for deep change. See, I don't want to do little change. Here's a little change. We're just going to do a few projects. Here's a little change. We're going to rebuild some houses in Haltom City. Here's a little change. We're going to do some projects in Vietnam. Listen to me. If we want to go for radical change, we have to go for deep internal change. Because we can do projects all day long. The question is, why are we doing them, and what is the result for what we do, whether it's here or the other side of the world? That's the question. So here's Paul. And man, he's got a tough road to hoe. Because he's already made it real clear that the gospel is for everyone. And Peter believes it. And all the other apostles believe it. And everyone else believes it. But here's the problem with it. They're living as if it doesn't matter. So the Jews are hanging out with the Jews. They're isolating themselves from the Gentiles here, not treating them with respect at all. And as a result of that, the change isn't happening. So I want you to look with me, if you will, and we're just going to tackle this together as far as we could get. In Galatians 6:4, we're going to start with the last chapter. And here's the great tragedy of Galatians. Most theologians, most commentators, Luther and Calvin included, spend the majority of their time on the first 3 chapters of Galatians. But there are 3 other chapters in Galatians, chapter 4, 5, and 6. And once you know that Jesus is in your heart, it's not enough to say, okay, I get Galatians 1, 2, and 3. Then how do we live out chapters 4, 5, and 6? That's the question we find ourselves at today. Galatians 6:4, but each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone. And not in regard to another, for each one will bear his own load. The one who is taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches. And do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not lose heart in doing good. You ever get tired of doing the right thing? You ever get tired of doing good? For in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good. Now, let me just share with you 5 things, and I may just get through the first thing this morning. How's that? But this is for deep change. Here's the first thing. If there's going to be radical deep change, first of all, it's about grace, not religion. It's about grace, not religion. Look what it says in verse 13 of chapter 6. For those who are circumcised do not even keep the law to themselves. Now here's what he's talking about. The whole book of Galatians has been dealing with the difference between law and grace. Here's what happens. The church emerges in Galatia. Paul is preaching like crazy. He's excited. He's enthusiastic. He's talking about how knowing God is based upon what Jesus did on the cross, not following the rules. And so as a result of that, there's a tremendous amount of freedom that people feel. They go, well, hey, I can know God because I don't have to worry about my works, and I don't have to worry if I match up, high enough, if I've earned my way enough to get to heaven. And so in the context of this, God has really got a hold of those people, and they're excited because it's grace. But here's the problem. There are these people that are called Judaizers. Keep in mind, Christianity started as a Jewish movement. And there are these people who come behind Paul and they say, okay, what Paul says is fine, but because he was a Jew and Christianity started out of Judaism, then you've got to follow all of this law. And they're coming back and they're putting all the regulations of the Old Testament back on. They're saying that men have to be circumcised, which is really hurting the growth of the church, no doubt. I mean, there's all this stuff that's going on. And Paul says, who has tricked you? Who has tricked you? Who has caused you to forget about what it means to follow me? And if you read in Galatians 1 and 6, he says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him, who called you by what? The grace of Christ, for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Now, Paul begins to talk about all of this in chapter 2. And he talks about how when he came to Antioch, he even had to help him understand that. And then Peter comes to Antioch, and Peter is in full agreement that the gospel is for the Gentiles, and there's no difference between the Jews and the Gentiles, because keep in mind, Jesus' apostles were all Jewish. Keep in mind, Paul is Jewish. So you've got to keep in mind the context of all of this. Paul would go to the synagogue every time he would start his work. And so the whole context is Judaism. So in that context of Judaism, some of them want to keep Judaism. They want to hold on to the law. They want to hold on to the rules. This grace stuff is just too hard for them to believe that Christ could forgive them, and it's not a matter of their works, or it's not a matter of performance. Paul said Peter agreed theologically, but his behavior didn't match it up. You understand? His behavior didn't match it up. Here's what his behavior was doing. Peter was saying, yeah, I believe all that, but what would happen? All the Jews would come together and hang out together. And so you wound up with the Gentiles over here who were viewed as dogs, the Gentiles who were viewed as unclean because they didn't have all these dietary laws and they didn't follow everything that Leviticus said. And so it was as if even though the Christians knew that they had Jesus just like they did, there was this separation between the two. There were the haves and the have-nots. Man, we are so good at doing that today, aren't we? It's no different. I got the Holy Spirit and you don't. I understand theology and you don't. It's the same thing. Same thing. It's not new to today. It's been going on in the church throughout all of church history. And Paul says he stood up to Peter right there, face to face. Why did he do that? Theologically, he agreed because it was hypocrisy. If you read on in Galatians 2, he says the word, he said it was hypocritical. Scripture's real clear. Your yes is yes and your no is no. When it's anything less, we always get into trouble. So here, Paul is trying to drive back the home. It's about grace because these Galatian Christians feel inferior to others. So they're trying to keep all the law. They're trying to initiate all this stuff within them because they don't want to be looked down upon. And what's the result? There's a schism that takes place. You know, we have problems with grace today. Really. Most of us have a real struggle with grace, believing that God's grace is really sufficient. Do you know why? We like the point system. Grace is contrary to how most of us live our lives. It really is. I mean, hey, how many of you, when you took a test in school, some of you kids in school, some of you guys in college, how many of you took a test and just said, I'm not going to worry about the answers, I'm just going to walk up and say, teacher, I need grace? What would your teacher do? Teenagers, what would your teacher do if you walked up to him and said, you know what, I just don't know the answers to this, but I love you so much, grace and mercy, I want you to give me 100 and I don't want to put the answers down? What would happen? How many of you parents would be tickled to death if your kids did that, if they went to school tomorrow and said, I get grace, and so I told my teacher that my grades are now based upon grace? I remember when I was going to Baylor, I was crazy. I never studied, kind of. Well, I did study a little bit on occasion or two, but I remember one time I wrote these crazy poems, and I mean, I just crazy. And I sent one home to my big sister. And my parents, this is when they used to, at the university, they would send you home a deficiency slip. And I got a deficiency slip in Greek. So when I say the Greek says you need to hope and pray, that's the Greek I got at seminary, not at Baylor. I slept through that Greek. My dad stapled the poem together with the deficiency slip and said, son, I think there might be a relationship. My dad is a Baptist preacher who preaches grace. But let me tell you something. He had no grace. None. How many of you guys just walk into the house, throw your stuff everywhere, make a mess? Say, it's grace, baby. It's grace. It's a point system. How many of you show up at work and your response at work is, I'm not going to work that hard. I love you. You're a great guy. It's just grace. You're going to need a new job. Is there anything in life that matches up to that? That's why grace is so hard. It doesn't jive with how we parent, how we do marriage, how we work, how we do life. And yet Christ comes and he goes with this totally contrary understanding of what it means to know God. And it's grace. It's not works. And see, if you really want deep change, guys, do what you do because God is telling you what to do. Do what you do because he loves you, not because you're earning your way to heaven. Can I tell you something? You can spend all your money. You can go to Vietnam. You can live in a dirt floor, bamboo, thatched grass roof hut. And God is not going to love you any more than if you live where you live right now. You cannot make God love you more by what you do. He already loves you completely, all the way through. You're not going to make him think you're a better person. I hear people say things to me all the time like, I'm going to get my life cleaned up, then I'm going to come back to God. No, you're already infected by the sin virus. And he loves you. See, guys, here's what I want you to understand. We got a disconnect. We got a bunch of disconnects. One of the disconnects we have is, what is God doing around the world, and yet why is he not doing that same thing here in America? And we don't want to change anything. We just want to keep, doing the same old thing. Another disconnect we have is, what I do, does that really change God's view of me? Not at all. All we need to do is be obedient to what he tells us to do. Because, see, he knows your warts. He knows your sin. He knows everything about you. And yet, he loves you. And see, here's my concern. I want to see our city changed. Amen? You guys want to see our city changed? I want to see our city changed. I want to see our church changed. I want to see your family changed. I want to see your life changed. I want to see our world changed. And it's only going to happen through grace. That's it. You'll never be able to do enough for God. I have a friend. He's an incredible painter. He primarily does portraits. And so he's painted some well-known people. And so one day I was in his studio and I was talking to him and asking him about it. And he was telling me all kind of funny stories about famous people who he's painted. And many of these people, he's painted them skinnier. I asked him, could you paint a picture of me and make me muscular and sexy? He said, sure. A lot of people like portraits, and portraits were huge until we had photographs because it was a way people would remember. But people can get paintings, and you can cut off pounds, and you can add hair or take it away, whatever the case might be. And he said, Bob, here's the funniest story. You want me to tell you? And I said, yes. And I'd tell you who this painter is, but I don't want to get him in trouble. So I'll tell you the story, and maybe sometime I can tell you who it is. But anyhow, this very famous woman came for him to paint her. And so he did. And all day long he kept painting her. And he could see the detail. Everything about it. And as he would look at her, he realized her nose was not straight. And he thought, man, I don't know what to do because I'm going to offend this lady. This is a very prominent lady, and yet her nose isn't straight. And how do I paint it? Do I paint it like it really is, or do I paint it straight? So he didn't know what to do. So he kept looking at the painting, and he knew it wasn't true because he's a very successful portrait painter. And so finally the next morning, her husband was over there, and she was sitting in the spot to be painted, and she's sitting there, and he's painting her, and finally he says, listen, I don't want to offend you, but when I come upon things on people and I see that are messed up, I try to ask them what they want done, and your nose, ma'am, is not straight. What would you like for me to do? And all of a sudden the blood went out of her face. She hung her head, big sigh. And her husband was shaking his head. And the husband said, dear, do you want me to tell him? She said, sure, go ahead. We've had her nose operated on 5 times. And every time we did it, the doctor said it was perfect. And the last time we went to the most famous nose doctor in the world, and we had the nose fixed, and he said it was perfect. And he said, I'm sorry. Listen, God knows your imperfections. You may look awful good this morning. He knows what you really look like. He sees you for what you are. It's about grace. All global transformation starts with grace.